take it away.
All right, thank you, Erin, for that, I think, very helpful framing, and thanks more broadly for convening this conversation. I'm delighted to learn that there are a number of us who are thinking about how to teach theory in ways that meet the challenges of the current moment, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share my own experiences in attempting to restructure my own course. I'm also, I will say, delighted that I get a chance to learn from what others have done in this domain. I certainly don't feel like I've resolved all of the issues in my own teaching, and this is still very much a work in progress. So since my graduate theory syllabus, I believe, was pre-circulated to this group prior to our discussion today, I'm going to assume some familiarity with the content of my course and not go through it in detail. I'll restrict myself here just to making a few brief comments on the nuts and bolts of teaching this course. And as a prefatory remark, I should note that the course I teach is not actually a traditional classical theory course in the sense that that usually implies. And this reflects the fact that our full year theory sequence at Michigan is not structured as the conventional classical contemporary sequence. Instead, the first semester, the course that I teach, is broadly construed as pure theory with a capital T if you like, whereas the second semester is theory as it has been applied in various empirical domains in the discipline, so kind of a mid-range theory, if you like, Robert Merton's terminology. So in the reflection on teaching theory that I wrote for Perspectives at the end of last year, which I think was also pre-circulated to this group, I noted three principles that guided the revision of my theory syllabus. First, I suggested moving from thinking about the historical context in which a given text was written to focus instead more on what I called its historical conditions of possibility. What I mean by this is that while I think knowing the historical context of a particular text can help us to understand it, too often that exercise can turn into a kind of apology for unsavory views that a given theorist may have expressed. Instead, I think more fruitful questions direct our attention to what I call the historical conditions of possibility for a given work. In other words, what must have been true about a given society, its institutions and power relations that allowed this piece to be written and that elevated it to canonical status. The second principle that I elaborated involved making contemporary critical works speak to the omissions, silences, and exclusions in canonical texts. And I think this was largely successful as a strategy for teaching this material with some caveats, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. Students appreciated reading works out of time, and this structure opened up many generative possibilities for discussion. I also think that this kind of structure works to disrupt the authority of canonical texts, since at least part of this authority comes from the sense that canonical works belong in a fixed historical lineage. So in this sense, reading classical and contemporary texts against each other reveals the act of construction and creating the canon in the first instance. Finally, the third principle was what I termed repurposing theory. This referred to the notion that theories that we now find objectionable because of their racism, Eurocentrism, misogyny, and so on, can contain elements that may be turned against the original intention of those who produced them. Gail Rubin's Traffic in Women, I suggested, offers a brilliant example of using elements of Freud's psychoanalysis, a body of ideas that are often considered to be misogynistic in nature, in order to construct a theory of the origins of gender subordination, a theory which had as its ultimate aims, of course, human emancipation. And I think in this sense, it's important that we teach students to flexibly appropriate from theories that they find objectionable, rather than dismiss these theories outright. Sometimes we find useful tools in unexpected places. So having laid out those broad principles that guided the revision of my syllabus, I want to talk in the remainder of my time a bit more about how the course worked in practice. And here I want to focus just on the second of those three principles that I just described, that is reading contemporary critical works against canonical texts. given the structure of our theory curriculum here at Michigan, which again doesn't fetishize the distinction between classical and contemporary works, it was quite organic to weave in contemporary writings that interrogated the silences and exclusions of canonical texts. So we read Charles Mills against Locke, Wendy Brown against Smith, Cedric Robinson against Marx, Victor Ray against Weber, Nancy Fraser against Polanyi, and so on. Now, the main challenge with this approach was simply the amount of material that I felt compelled to include in one semester. This is a course that starts with Thomas Hobbes and ends with Pierre Bourdieu, so it's an ambitious scope. And there's, in that sense, a very real temptation that I think we all face as theory instructors to overload the syllabus with too much reading. That's something that I struggled with even before there was a movement to reconstruct and expand the canon. So it's been that struggle has been amplified in the current context. So the strategy I devised around this last fall was to assign some common readings that we all did as a class, and then other readings, I called them extensions, that were read only by a subset of students who then reported back to the full class on how those selections challenged, refined, or extended the perspective that was presented in the common reading. And this was, in some way, a strategy for covering all the ground that I wish to cover, while having the total amount of reading assigned to any given student still remains somewhat manageable. But I think this strategy was ultimately unsuccessful, and I say that for two distinct reasons. First, just as a matter of signaling, it's difficult to avoid the impression that the reading assigned to everyone, the readings assigned to everyone were somehow more important than the readings that I had assigned to only a subset of students. This kind of tiered structure in a syllabus, I think, inadvertently reinforces the authority of canonical texts, even while nominally trying to call that authority into question. Now, one way around that problem is, of course, to be sure that the common readings include theorists who are not typically read as part of the canon. But there are, I think, built-in limits in terms of what one adds and cuts from a reading list. Secondly, at a more pedagogical level, it simply didn't work well to have a common discussion with only a subset of students having engaged the extension's readings. The learning experience felt, I think, somewhat fragmented, and for this reason was unsatisfying. So in the version of the class that I plan to introduce this fall, accordingly, I'm going to do away with this kind of tiered structure. All readings will be common readings, including the more contemporary and critical pieces that I have selected to push against the authority of canonical text. And this will, of course, require serious paring back in terms of how much reading I can assign for any given week, but I actually think there's a way to read theory where less is more, especially as we ask students to go deep inside texts and do serious interpretive work. Now, it does require us to make careful decisions about what it is we want to convey about a given thinker's work and what could be better left to more specialized courses taken later in a given student's training. What is it that I want students to take away? What is it that I want students to take away from Weber's essay on bureaucracy? Is it necessary to have them slog through all 50 plus pages of that essay to get this? Is there a section that effectively conveys the core insight? Now, I don't want to minimize the difficulty of doing this or to underplay the dangers in this approach, namely that we reduce our teaching of these texts to a superficial sampling in which we have pre-digested all of the critical lessons for students. But I do think that with thought and care, it should be possible to read less of the canonical texts while reading them more deeply, aided in this endeavor by works outside of the canon that help to correct for its omissions and blind spots. Now, Erin posed some specific questions for us to address, and in my remaining minutes, I want to offer thoughts on just one of these questions, which was reiterated a moment ago in Erin's introductory remarks. Erin asked specifically whether classical theory should be a required course for our students or made an elective, or perhaps most radically eliminated altogether. My answer to this is that classical theory should remain part of the core sociology curriculum. But in saying that, I think it's absolutely essential that we are very clear about our purpose in requiring that all students take some version of a classical theory course. My purpose in teaching sociological theory is to give students a sense for a core intuition, the core intuition of sociology as a discipline. That intuition, in my view, has to do with the sense that there is a kind of alchemy in social life, such that in collectivities we are transformed from who we are as individuals. In stark contrast to the liberal and utilitarian traditions in social thought, in which the social is a mere aggregation of the individuals who make it up, the sociological tradition insists that our very nature is remade when we come into sustained contact with others. Rousseau wrote about the positive transcendence of our individual selves through the act of association. Marx echoed Rousseau in introducing the concept of species being. With somewhat less poetry, making an analogy to chemistry, Durkheim noted that collectivities like molecules have properties not found in the individual atoms that form the whole. The canonical thinkers, however distinct they may have been in their methodological approaches and substantive focus, all shared some version of this key idea. And in this regard, I really don't care that my graduate students, much less my undergraduates, can cite chapter and verse of Capital or the elementary forms of religious life. But I do want my students to understand deep in their bones this fundamental insight about the nature of the social and to carry it forward into their investigations in sociology in whatever empirical field they pursue. These texts bring that insight into sharp relief, especially when they are read against works in the liberal and utilitarian tradition, as they are in my course. Now, I think it's important to say that Marx and Durkheim are not the only thinkers who offer this lesson. But they do convey it with particular force and clarity. And that is the primary reason that I'm committed to teaching these works, however flawed and limited these writings are in other respects. Now I want to note here, just as an aside, that the formation of the discipline itself is a bit beside the point for me. And the purpose of my course is not to survey the history of the field. I think we've learned from recent scholarship that the canonical texts fit into that history in a fairly haphazard way, if they fit at all. Rather, my goal is to deliver an intuition and have students experience that intuition in a deep way. And I think this is critical to do, given that as a discipline, we are not bound by a core set of methodological principles or a shared set of empirical topics. Our common identity as sociologists really does revolve around a simple yet profound intuition about the nature of the social. And I'll stop there so that we hopefully have some time for discussion. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Greta. That was really very interesting. I really appreciate your insight. So I've opened up the chat, so everyone should be able to share now if they'd like to share questions that they have that they'd like Greta to answer when we get to our Q&A at the end. I'm also going to share the link to Greta's essay. I tried to circulate this as far and wide to everyone who approached me individually, but if you for some reason haven't seen it, there's the link to the essay, and at the top of the chat you should have the link to the shared folder that has the syllabi that were referenced. Remember to put your questions in the chat while it's open. And then next up, just to preview, we have Jose Itzigsohn from Brown. And I know, Jose, you are going to share your screen. So do you want to get that set up then? Oh, you're muted. Let's unmute you here. Hang on.
Yes, I prepare a small PowerPoint just to be organized and say all that I want to say in the allocated time. So first of all, thank you for inviting us to this event, and thank all of you for being here in this digital space where we meet these days. I'm going to share with you my thoughts on decolonizing sociological theory, which come out from teaching many years classical theory and writing a book on W.E.B. Du Bois, the book that Erin showed you earlier. So I think it's important to teach theory. because theory gives us a perspective and forces us to face our assumptions about society, about history, about individuals. I believe that John Maynard Keynes was right when he famously said that practical people that think that they don't have intellectual influence are usually slaves to some defunct economist. And I also believe with Dipesh Chakravarty in Provincializing Europe that the European theorists have shaped too much of our thoughts to ignore them or to not try to understand them and understand their assumptions. So I think that theory gives us perspective, and theory also tells us what questions are legitimate and what methods are legitimate. And if we don't ask ourselves that, if we are not reflective about that, we end up reproducing the same methods and the same questions that generate epistemic exclusions and also exclude from our ranks a lot of people. The male European theories that make our canon have some differences between them, but they also have a shared vision. They see modernity as endogenous to European history and as universal history, and that marginalizes the experience and histories of racialized and colonized people. It puts them in the waiting room, not of Zoom, but of modernity. And if we study only that, we are going to keep marginalizing people and marginalizing viewpoints. So what I think that we need to do in rethinking sociological theory, in decolonizing it, is on the one hand, do what Chakravarty tells us to do with European thought, provincializing it, understand it as a perspective that emerges from a specific historical experience and understand its assumptions and the assumptions that we have internalized from it, and teach alternative perspectives to this established Eurocentric male canon. That is, not just add text from thinkers that are not European as, okay, let's contrast this or that, or let's add this person to make a diverse syllabus, but teach them as alternative perspectives, alternative ways of looking at things from different histories and from different standpoints and with different assumptions. And let's contrast those viewpoints, assumptions, and experiences. What I do in my classical graduate seminar is I start with Anna Julia Cooper and W.E.B. Du Bois. From Anna Julia Cooper, I teach her early theories on gender and her theory on the intersectionality of gender and race. And from Du Bois, I teach his theories on racialized modernity, on racial and colonial capitalism, on racialized subjectivity, and the marvelous ways in which he brings all those things together. And then I teach Eurocentric theories through the angle of Cooper's and Du Bois' perspective. And through that, we can see both their limitations and we can see also other ways of thinking about the world, thinking about the relationship between individuals and society, thinking about our historical moment. So to me, this is fundamental, not to add additional speakers, or let's study this and that, or contrast, but to contrast perspectives, and contrast perspectives that come from different standpoints and acknowledge those standpoints. And let's understand the assumptions that are, in the views in which we see the world behind these standpoints. So that's why I say, teach them as alternative perspectives to the Eurocentric canon, and name the Eurocentric canon as Eurocentric male canon with all its problems. If we do that, I think what we get is a very different view of the modern world, and also a very different view of sociological theory and sociological methodology. And this, this slide is probably the key to my presentation. So instead of the assumption of modernity as endogenous European process, we see modernity as global and inherently tied to racism and colonialism. We see the centrality of racism and colonialism in the constitution of the modern world. We realize that we cannot understand the pervasiveness of racism without colonialism. We cannot understand global migration without understanding the changing forms of colonialism and neocolonialism. We cannot understand children in cages without understanding colonialism. We cannot understand global inequalities without centering colonialism and empire. So we put racism and colonialism at the center of our understanding of the modern world. And instead of a sociology that marginalizing the study of race and gender, that says that these are different fields of sociology that, you know, the specialists will look like, we bring racism and heteropatriarchy and intersectional analysis to the center of all fields of sociology. So we cannot speak about organizations without looking at how they are raised, how they are gendered. We cannot look at inequality without talking about racism and heteropatriarchy. We cannot talk about economic sociology without looking at how racism and heteropatriarchy shapes them. So there is not more, you know, a section on gender and a section on race. Those are at the center of all fields of sociology. Instead of a sociology that looks at national societies at the units of analysis, we practice a sociology that is global and relational, that breaks with analytical bifurcation, which breaks with looking at processes of change as happening in you know, the metropolitan core countries as universal process and as detached from other processes. So if we look at citizenship in England, we look at citizenship in England together with the denial of citizenship in other parts of the empire, and we relate citizenship to empire. Instead of abstracting from history, as both Weber and Park taught us, I mean, history and sociology as different realms of thinking, we build a sociology that is deeply rooted in history, in understanding of the historical formation of the present, and in understanding of the historical moment as racialized modernity, racial and colonial modernity. And instead of a sociology that aims to theorize from detached universal positions, as Marx, Weber, Durkheim aim to do, we emphasize theorizing from experience and particular standpoints, as Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper do. It's theorizing that is conscious to lived experience and is conscious to looking at the world from a certain experience, and is conscious of criticizing at the world from those standpoints. So when we do this exercise of contrasting different perspectives on the modern and different perspectives on society from different standpoints, we get a very different look at the world and a very different look at the methodologies and at the questions that we can ask. That's why I think it's important to study theory. That's why I think that this is a fundamental exercise, because we cannot decolonize our ways of thinking if we don't engage in understanding the assumptions and presuppositions that we make when we are empirical sociologists. So what is to be done to decolonize our discipline? Well, point one, learn subaltern theories before teaching them. I mean, I'm against, you know, adding an article by Du Bois or Anna Julia Cooper and putting in a syllabus at the end or at some other place without understanding these scholars and without understanding the full theories of these scholars. That's why Carida Brown and I wrote the book on the sociology of the W.E. Du Bois. Now I'm working on Anna Julia Cooper. I don't know when I will write about her, but I read enough about her and the secondary literature about her to know that I can teach her well. So we need to do a lot of work of teaching, of learning these theories as we teach them. Second, for all my talk about decolonizing, there is a clear omission in my syllabus, which are indigenous perspectives. And the discipline has been nothing but horrendous when it comes to the study of indigenous people. There is very little of what it is. Most of it is from the perspective of ethnicity, which is the completely wrong perspective. I can count probably in the fingers of one or two hands the sociologists that deal with the fundamental elements of indigenous experiences, which are settler colonialism, genocide, displacement, and the struggle for land and cultural survival. And we have really been doing a bad job on that. And those of us who teach classical sociology, it's upon us to ask us the question that we never asked, that is, who were the indigenous thinkers thinking about society at the time in which sociology was emerging? And those who teach contemporary sociology have the duty of read the enormous wealth of contemporary literature coming from indigenous studies, and that is really fantastic theory, and we need to read it and bring it into sociology. So I don't have shortcuts, just a lot of work to do to decolonize theory. And you can tell me, well, but we are empirical sociologists, we don't have time for that, that's not what we signed up for. And I understand, I am an empirical sociologist too. But we need to do that exactly because theory is at the root of our empirical work. And we can do it while we do empirical work by expanding the questions we ask, by expanding the methods we use, by reading folks out of the discipline and incorporating their perspectives and their questions. And we can do it also by encouraging our critical students. We have all encountered critical students that push our boundaries. And often the response in the discipline is to discipline them. I mean, to tell them, well, that's nice, but that's not sociology. That's the wrong thing. We do not need to discipline them into the discipline. We need them to let them run with their critical insights. But then we also need to hire them. Otherwise, we don't do any favor to anyone and we don't change anything. And finally, I think that we need to open up the top journals to alternative perspectives and methodologies. The top journals are gatekeepers of jobs and promotions, and as long as the top journals keep enforcing very limited views of what is sociology, we will keep perpetuating epistemic exclusions, and we will keep excluding from the discipline young, critical, challenging scholars, particularly young, critical, challenging scholars, minority young, critical, challenging scholars. So that is what I have to say. Just a lot of work to decolonize the discipline, but I think it's worth doing. Okay, thank you very much.
Jose, thank you so much. So Jose bringing us a strong encouragement to think about how we theorize from particular standpoints. I love the sort of undercurrent of denaturalizing and deneutralizing the presumed neutrality of the white male experience that a lot of the original theorists spoke from. And both speakers giving us some really concrete steps forward, which as someone who has to like do this in a month, I deeply appreciate. So our next panelist, once again, I'm gonna open as we make the transition up so you guys can post questions if you have them now, if you wanna share your questions now. Our next panelist is Zine Magubane. She comes to us from Boston College. She has shared in the shared resources folder her classical sociological theory, where she aims to think about relevant in a global and post-colonial world. Zine is also the incoming chair of the Global and Transnational Sociology section, and so perhaps we'll hear her kind of echoing some of the calls that we heard Jose pointing us towards just a second ago. Zine, are you ready to take the stage?
All right, am I all unmuted?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sure. So obviously I agree with so much of what the two people that went before me said, and I hope not to retread any of that ground. I think what I'll start with is that provocative question of, should we even have classical theory at all? Should we just get rid of it? I was actually asked this question on a panel I was on with Julian Go, that was at Harvard a couple of, maybe 2 years ago or something, to commemorate Du Bois's birthday. And we, Julian and I are old friends, and we really kind of disagreed. He was sort of like, burn it all down, teach new stuff, teach different stuff. And I kind of said half jokingly, well, I kind of think you have to go to war with the army you have. In other words, it will take a really long time to get people to toss it out. You open yourself up to all kinds of claims, like you're tossing it out to be politically correct, or somehow that, studying the experiences of marginalized groups, whatever that means, is anti-theoretical or atheoretical, right? In other words, I just don't see classical theory going anywhere. I also think that it represents a really interesting opportunity in that much of the silencing and occlusion of things like slavery and colonialism and racism happened not at the time that the persons wrote, but rather through the process of canonization. In other words, one Comte, who's someone I'm kind of working on right now, he's generally mentioned the founder of sociology, invented the term, gave us the terms of progress and so forth, and people sort of blow right by and don't read anything that he wrote. Actually, if you read him carefully, he was well aware of things like the Haitian Revolution. In fact, it was Du Bois who pointed out in 1961 that, and this is where I was led on this journey, Du Bois pointed out that in Comte's calendar of great men, he included Toussaint Louverture. And it was in fact for me trying to figure out, like, why was he there, that I went to actually read Comte and discovered he did indeed write about the Haitian Revolution. He wrote about France as a slaveholding colony and what it meant to have lost their richest colony. He wrote about the Algerian, you care from, and he has plenty of terribly racist things that he said about progress and hierarchies of civilization. He also said things like Haiti was an amazing thing that happened, and it was where the formerly enslaved realized their destiny. He also said that France had no business in Algeria, and in fact, that basically it was a way of the France to detract from their own class problems at home. So I think that, some of the times when we read the classical theorists, it tends to look like things like slavery and colonialism were unimportant because of what we read of them, or not only what we read of them, but looking only for discussions of slavery and colonialism in that context of race and racism. Comte approached it through a question of mercantilism, actually, because the slavery was also a protectionist system. And could a protectionist system, survive in the new political age? So for me, I've decided that the way in which I like to classical theory, and I'm not sure what the syllabus you have, because it changes all the time, because I'm learning all the time. And I'm having to learn about times in history that I never thought fit together. But what you learn as a global sociologist, of course, is about interconnection, right? Gurminda Bahamra's notion about connected sociologies and connected histories. And once you approach the world in that way, and not only think about, is it possible that we have overlooked what some of these people have to say about these things? Also that we overlook the fact that they're all living through the same events. And the people who wrote about those events at the time were well aware that they were worldly events. So there's a sort of a way that we kind of forget, Comte also lived through the Revolution of 1848, as did Marx. Marx was also deeply interested in it because he was also interested in the question of slavery on American soil. Marx also reads the first two works written in English with sociology in their title, Sociology for the South. He even talks about them and critiques them, right? That's not a Marx that we hear about when we hear about the Eurocentric Marx, right? So I have set about, in this book that I'm trying to write and the way I'm seeking to teach theory going forward, is to try to look at still the canonical thinkers, but with an openness to actually the world historically that they wrote about in real time. They were oftentimes aware that because the colonies were so central to their own nations, they're actually aware of and wrote about their on world history. In terms of the connected sociologies piece, I mean, if you start with Comte, which everybody does, you will see that some of the first people who wrote about sociology in the United States were the Southern Comteans, who were also slaveholders. And you have to ask yourself, well, why did they read Comte? And exploring and unpacking all of that, it leads you immediately to agreeing, as many have said, that sociology was the, quote, science of the new industrial society, but recognizing that anyone who wrote at that time about the new industrial society was aware of a couple of things. One, that with the ending of slavery, the main cash crop that fueled the Industrial Revolution, cotton, was no longer going to be grown by enslaved persons. So it immediately moves to the center of that question of the science of the new industrial society, and it explains why so many plantation holders, people like Alfred Stone, wrote in about sociology, right? Like why sociology was the discipline that they hooked onto, or why they called their studies sociology. It also leads you into what I think is one of the central cores around sociology, is not only the science of the new industrial society, but the question of what makes people work, right? And again, I'm not the first person to have said this. Zimmerman has said this, and there's another book about Weber in America, but it's now known, or coming to be known, that when Weber came to the US in 1904, he was interested to go to Tuskegee Institute. He was interested to talk to Booker T. Washington. Weber himself thought that Du Bois was a great thinker and thought he was the best thinker on the question of the pressing question of the day. And it was not because Weber was some sort of politically correct person, but Du Bois was writing precisely about labor compulsion in the South. How do you move from compulsion, a person is owned in their body, to the compulsion of the market, which is at the center of much of sociology. And unlike the way it's canonized, the people who wrote at the time were well aware that the fact that the experiment of how do you move from bonded to free labor, the biggest experiment was happening in the American South. And that was known by the people writing at the time. And that's some of those connected histories that I want to bring out. I think it's important to talk about why people like Franklin Giddings sent their students. One of Franklin Giddings' main students was this guy, Thomas Jesse Jones. He goes and works at Hampton Institute. He later takes Hampton and Tuskegee principles and applies them to the colonization of Africa. And so in writing about these connections, also different voices come in. So of course, Du Bois is writing about these questions the whole time. Anna Julia Cooper as well. So we often think of her as only focused on the domestic, but she herself was in conversation with people like Edward Blyden. People like Blyden are deeply interested in what is happening in Tuskegee Institute. There are schools being built in Liberia. Everyone knows about Booker T. Washington's experiment of growing cotton in Togo, right? And so actually, I guess just to reiterate that these things were known at the time. And how I see doing a rethinking of classical sociology is to make it clear or make it known that the people who were writing at the time knew and acknowledged these things. And sometimes it was not just in the process of canonization, but in their own efforts to make sociology a science, that they had to write out the practical and applied things that they did to get the insights. So, elsewhere I've written about Robert Park and when he wrote Introduction to the Science of Sociology, right? So he writes this book, The Green Bible, that gives sociology a name, a focus, a place amongst the disciplines. He says that's what he sets out to do. It's the same guy who says, the person that I learned the most from in all of my life was Booker T. Washington. And so although it is not immediately there, he doesn't say in the book, these are the things that I'm occluding or suppressing. I kind of think that's my job. And hopefully if I do my job well, none of you else will have to. You can just buy the book. But essentially what I like to do is to see where those occlusions happen, right? When Weber, well known, he writes half of the Protestant ethic, comes to the US, has the thing in the American South, writes the second half. Where can we see that experience woven in and then simultaneously silenced in what he writes, right? So my way of doing classical theory is a little bit different in the sense of I'm still learning as I'm teaching the course, and I'm learning all the time. What I'm hoping to do is to instill these insights into some sort of digestible form, because as I was asked when I spoke at Orlando Patterson's seminar, the person who's currently teaching classical theory at Harvard, I think it was Usmani Adana, said, well, what if we don't want to learn all of this and we just have to teach the course? And I agree. That's why, I think it's so important what Jose has done, what Alden has done, what Julian has done. We're going to have to make it digestible for people, right? Not everybody is going to want to go back and learn a globalized and imperial reread of the Industrial Revolution and global history in order just to get through a class that they might have been assigned. But I think that's where the interesting work for those of us who are in this field comes in, that we're actually trying to rewrite the thing and make it teachable, just as Parsons and everybody else did for the first generation. Make it teachable for people that they either have things in front of them, like they can teach Anna Julia Cooper or Du Bois as Jose or Alden has shown them to, or you can just have a book on your syllabus that you can either point people to or give yourself a better idea of the historical time. So maybe teach Comte how you want, but at least I'll tell you that some of what he wrote was in response to the collapse of Haiti, and some of it was in response to France's incursions in Algeria. And if you want to go make of what you will about or keep teaching him the way you've taught him, also, again, some enterprising person in the seminar may be able to make some new connections on their own. So that's kind of where, to sum it up, that's where I see. I see the classical theory is not going anywhere, so it's not really, debatable whether it can stay or go. But like Raewyn Connell says, I don't think it's a question of adding more people per se. It's giving us a better history to do a different kind of sociology.
Thank you so much. That was a really powerful way to end as well, that sense of giving us a better history to do better sociology with it. And I cannot wait until your book is done. I think the kind of flourishing of excitement, we mentioned earlier the idea of journals being open to publishing more perspectives. I think that there is a real hunger for this, and I hope that book publishers see that as well, and that you are fending them off with a stick, the number of book publishers who are hoping for that manuscript.
Yeah, people are into it. I mean, I think everybody recognizes that sociology has a reckoning, right? Like they don't want to be left behind. So I think there's a space.
Agree. So for our last panelist, before we hit our Q&A time, we have Jocelyn Viterna. Jocelyn is coming from a slightly separate perspective in the sense that she's going to focus on how she's been thinking through some of these issues through the lens of being the director of undergraduate studies at Harvard, and thinking through theory within the undergraduate curriculum as well. And also from something of an outsider's perspective, if I understand correctly, Jocelyn herself has not had to teach the theory, but has kind of been part of these conversations around it because of her role as the DOS. So Jocelyn, welcome to the panel.
Thank you all. And yes, to follow up on Zine's point, I think I keep realizing that this is a bigger, or an issue that's gathering a lot of interest and support in our discipline. And this chat, I think, is a key example of that. I completely thought that I'd be here having a talk with 10 or 15 people, and we have over 100 people on this call in the middle of summer. So I think that really speaks to how urgent this issue is for us to think about. As Erin said, I'm not sort of a person who does my research in a historical or classical theory. And in fact, I would say I was, for most of my academic life, have been anti-classical theory, right? It always felt like that thing that we do to haze people to get them into the discipline of sociology. And when you read these classical theory books as an undergraduate or even as a graduate student, they oftentimes would start out saying we have to read Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, in part because they're the founders of sociology, and also because and you can go read this if you grab whatever classical theory book you have on your shelf, many of them say like they're exemplars of how we do good theory. And I remember even as an undergraduate thinking like, what bullshit, right? Like they don't have evidence, they're not like thinking counterfactually, like they're just coming up with these big ideas. And we don't do theory that way in sociology anymore. We don't do these big grand theories of the world. So I never really saw the relevance of it. As I became the director of undergraduate studies at Harvard, we had a theory syllabus that kind of kept getting taught, and I just let it go on. I wasn't really going to mess in that area of the program until I had a group of students come in, young students, largely with racialized identities, and they said to me, Jocelyn, what's up with all these white guys on the theory syllabus? I was like, well, and they said, you really should educate yourself on this. And so I took it to heart, and I knew that Raewyn Connell had written this article in ASR that I had never quite bothered to read. And so I pulled it out and I was like, wow, that's really fascinating, right? And I started reading some of what Alden Morris was putting out about W.E. Du Bois. I have a huge debt of gratitude to Zine, who sat down with me over a cup of coffee here in Boston and spent hours really trying to bring me up to date. And I realized that it felt like everything I'd been taught was a lie. And once you get into this, like I actually spent about 3 weeks that summer. I just went back and I pulled up all of AJS articles from the beginning, first edition of AJS, and I read about 20 years of AJS. It's all online. It's easy. It starts in 1895, and it's mind-boggling, right? It is the most racist, sexist, social evolutionary kinds of stuff, the Spencerian, Darwinian stuff you've ever read. There are lead articles about like eugenics, basically, right? Like the importance of social eugenics from Galton. There are 2 lead articles in AJS in the early years on eugenics. And I found, the Green Bibles online from Park. You can go look at this and see what kinds of things they're teaching and who they're citing. And although some people do cite Durkheim, not nearly as much as they cite Spencer or Park, but they do cite some Durkheim. Weber's pretty much non-existent in these works, and Marx is just nowhere to be found, right? And so it really struck me that what we are learning is not accurate. And that was problematic for me for a number of reasons. First of all, let me see how I want to go forward with this. So one of the things I think then that I started thinking about, how do we want to teach this? I think you've heard a lot of arguments already about why we should bring in other voices into the canon from all these other people who were writing early on. But one thing that maybe hasn't been said yet, but I think is important, is we actually need to bring in these early founders of sociology, particularly in the United States, the social evolution writers, right? And I think it's important to actually talk about what they were writing, because they really were very clearly responding to colonialism. And so you read these early works, it's all about social evolution, it's all about why white people have come to such a higher level of civilization compared to barbarians and savages. And you can really see some of the ways that things are very intellectually dishonest in early AJS articles. So there might be an article about that starts with the premise, like, we all know that women are naturally more interested in doing housekeeping than men. So how can we explain that, right? We all know that people with dark skin don't have as good of intellectual capacity or as high of intellectual development as people with white skin. So how do we explain that? And this is at the same time. Remember in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Tenochtitlan in Mexico was actually 5 times the size of London, right? They had libraries, they had floating gardens, they had zoos, they had aquariums, they had botanical gardens, they had incredible architecture, they had aqueducts that carried their waste out of the city so they didn't have the disease that they had in Europe. And again, they had written languages and they had libraries filled with their knowledge. And when colonialism happened, that knowledge was physically destroyed. It was lost, it was physically destroyed. And so in writing these stories about why white people are so much more evolved socially than these barbarians, you put that together with what you know about colonialism, and you see that early sociology really it had an agenda to explain the way that the world was. And it feels dishonest to me not to own that. So in thinking about how to write this class, in thinking about what to do with this, I've decided that it's important for us to teach a theory a different way, and specifically that we want to bring in not just the voices who have been written out in terms of Du Bois and Martineau and Cooper, and I'd add Wells and some of these other global South scholars, but I think we also need to bring in those voices who were written out, who are very distasteful. I think we need to own that. And so why do we need to bring these sort of mainstream social evolutionary people in from the early years? Well, first of all, I think we all know that theories develop in response to established theories. That's what we tell students to do, right? You write your literature review and you take in so-and-so said this, so-and-so said this, so we know X, we know Y, but hey, I'm gonna add Z to the mix. And so if we understand the discipline as sort of this collection of theories being built on top of each other, we have to be honest about what those initial theories were, because they still sort of peek their heads up in the way we think about sociology today. And we can't see that, and we can't be honest about that if we aren't honest about what our intellectual roots are. I mean, an example from my own work, wrote several years ago, I wrote an article about when we talk about gender and development, we code the world's countries by whether countries are sort of stagnating in gender or whether they're advancing in gender. And of course, my own work in Central America finds that they're actually going backwards in gender, they're regressing. And so I wrote this article saying, like, why don't we ever also code for people who are moving backwards in gender equality? And then I start reading this, I'm like, oh, because we still have this social evolutionary bent, that society's on this eternal progress towards some, right? Like, so there are these ways that you can see that the way we think about sociology is still sort of hardwired to something that was started long before us. And I think if we want to understand where those sort of Eurocentric ideas or developmental ideas come from, we have to understand what our, we're responding to people who are responding to people who are responding to people, all the way down to some of these early AJS authors. Secondly, see if I can read my writing here. We all know that theories don't just describe the social world, but they can also be constitutive of the social world, right? And so I think it's an awesome responsibility for students to understand that the ways we think about and describe the social world actually have implications. And one of the best ways to understand that responsibility is to think about and look at how these theories of social evolution in the early, in the founding of US sociology really were constitutive and actually supporting of the development of the society at the time, this very, very brutal colonial society. Third, I think we have to talk about this just because it's accurate. I mean, seriously, we would never teach a history that we knew was wrong in any other field. So why do we keep telling our students that Marx, Weber, and Durkheim founded sociology if we know we have extensive evidence, it's easy to see, it's all online, that it's not true? So why do we keep maintaining this inaccurate idea? Fourth, I think it's just such a better way to teach theory. Like I said, I used to hate theory. Theory was boring. Theory was like, let's sit and think about these big ideas. But once you sort of situate theory in the historical moment, and you see it as this conflictual understanding of different views of the world clashing and coming together, and how power elevates some of those theories over others, then it gets really exciting and it gets really relevant to me. And I certainly have seen at Harvard undergraduates that the ways that students engage this course have gone up dramatically. It's been increasingly better. People get much more excited about theory if you bring it to life in this way. So I think it's sort of higher interest, higher utility if we think about it this way. Fifth, I think we need to bring some of this, this more accurate history of sociology in, because if we write out the mainstream guys, if we write out the Spencer, the social evolutionists, the people we're embarrassed about, then that's when we also write out the critics, right? That's when we also write out Du Bois and Cooper and James and Ida B. Wells and all these people who stepped up and said, no, this is wrong. And actually, if you read those in conversation, like other people have said, if you read those in conversation with each other, you realize that looking at Du Bois' study of Philadelphia, and even looking at Ida B. Wells' like counting of lynchings, where the intellectual world is saying, no, there's no such thing as racism and lynchings are going away. And Ida B. Wells is the one out there documenting with evidence that there is this thing called racism and lynchings are going up. And what these critical scholars of the time are doing feels so much more like what we believe sociology is today, that you can just see these links. And so you really, I think one of the reasons to write back in the racist and the sexist is because that allows us to see the brilliance and the bravery of these early scholars at the time. So I do think we need to continue to teach classical theory, but the way we've approached it at Harvard, at least for the undergraduate level, is that we don't see it so much as like, this class is not teaching you how to theorize. I don't want any of my undergraduates to go out and try and develop a theory of the social world like Weber or Durkheim. But what I do want my undergraduates to understand is that knowledge is socially constructed, right? And that what we do in sociology is to socially construct knowledge about society. And so I think of the history of our discipline as important for them to know, not only so they understand where sociology came from, how we got here, and how we want to imagine it moving on in the future, but it's also sort of a really powerful case study of the importance of thinking about knowledge construction and critically evaluating how knowledge is created and used even today. And so that's how we've changed things in our department. It's become more of a history of sociology and an interrogation of the social construction of knowledge. And briefly, we spend a week on Marx, Faber, and Durkheim, so 3 weeks on each of them. We spend a week on sort of social evolutionists, Spencer, and the mainstream people. In that week, we kind of talk about how they were, Parsons declared Spencer dead, and he sort of formulated this new canon in the 1930s. And then we move on and we say, okay, who else was writing at this time that didn't get canonized? And that's when we bring in scholars with racialized identities, scholars with gendered identities, and we have 2 weeks of scholars of the Global South, some who are speaking directly back to the colonial process, but others who maybe they're just thinking about religion in India, or they're thinking about religion in China, and we can compare those with how Martineau and Durkheim talked about religion. And so we've tried to just really broaden the idea of who could be a sociologist at that time. The last thing I wanted to say, I'm sorry, I'm out of time. Let me just go over this quickly. I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of resistance to this. And I was surprised in my own department, because typically it feels like a lot of the senior faculty don't pay a lot of attention to what goes on in the undergraduate program. So I was just kind of making these changes on my own. And then I had several senior colleagues come and say, well, wait a minute, we invested a lot of time in that theory syllabus. We really like that class. Maybe you shouldn't be messing with it so much. And one of my senior colleagues even said, I know that students don't like the fact that or they don't like the fact that sociology was founded by old white guys, but the reality is sociology was founded by old white guys. And I remember looking at this senior colleague and saying, that's not true. And I certainly didn't realize that until embarrassing late in my own career. And the fact that I have senior colleagues at Harvard who still sort of articulate this fiction, I think is really problematic. And I think we have, we need to fix that in sociology. So problem number one, there's resistance because people don't know, and they need to learn, and that's partly because we keep teaching theory the same way. Secondly, I think there's resistance because people say, okay, so the canon was sort of constructed in this weird way by Parsons in the 30s and 40s, but it's still the canon. It's still what creates sociology today. So isn't it still worthwhile learning that if that's what sociology is built on, right? Even if it is incorrect. Third, I think people resist it because learning the canon, learning these classical people is sort of like, it is like hazing. It's what gets you in the club. And how do we know who's in the club if we don't have a group of people that we're all supposed to know and share together? And finally, I don't think we can underestimate this, but there's a real sense among scholars in sociology that if we change theory, if we change classical theory, then how am I the expert anymore? What happens if I'm no longer the expert? And so that gets to some of what Zine said as well. So I think there are real institutional pushbacks about creating a more accurate approach to the way we think about our disciplinary roots. But I think the importance of teaching something that's more accurate and that encourages students to engage these understandings of the social construction of knowledge, or the importance of the social construction of knowledge, is really the way to go. And it's been something we've been really proud of and found it's been very well received by students at Harvard.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. I really appreciate that view as well, like complementary to the rest of them. And I think it was helpful to articulate explicitly where some of the sources of resistance come from, because as each of us may in our own departments be facing some of that, anticipating some of the ways to work against that is an important way to try to move this forward practically. Because I think a lot of people here share the hope that this doesn't just end with like a lot of navel gazing and instead results in real sincere action. So now we have a little bit of time to open up for some Q&A, some questions, reflections that people want to share. I've forwarded to the panelists some of the questions that people sent to me. Some of them were posted publicly. You are able to respond and put questions publicly to the chat at this point if anyone wants to post questions for our panelists. So go ahead and post questions to the panelists as well, and I'll keep feeding some questions. But maybe, I know we had a question earlier about whether and how we should think or rethink periodicity. You know, Jocelyn had sort of a take on the fact that there, and Zine and some of our other panelists as well, that there were voices happening in that period. Should we rethink the period? Should we be less tied to the period as defining who makes this kind of syllabus? Do any of the panelists have thoughts on that?
I mean, I can say a couple of things. There are conventions. I don't think there's any. I could completely see the distinction being erased as long as we keep this understanding of the different perspectives. Doing it classical, contemporary has been, it turns out that sociologists are much more ritualistic than they like to think about themselves. But I don't think that we really need to keep that as long as we keep engaging with these different perspectives and contrasting perspectives and understanding this as perspectives that emerge from different standpoints and different histories, and we account for that, and we keep contrasting these views of sociology that I presented earlier. Maintaining classical, the difference is not real. I mean, I teach later texts by Du Bois. I teach The World and Africa, which is from 1947. I teach Schutz, which wrote in the 40s. So, I mean, even if you take Marx is dead in 1880s and Weber writes much later. So, I don't think that the differences are important. What I think is important is understanding the rootedness of these different perspectives in different historical experiences and the assumptions that they make.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that question about kind of period and how important period is, or whether we should do away with period? I guess Greta has sort of spoke to that issue in the beginning, saying that Michigan doesn't really use a period differentiation. Yeah, Jocelyn.
I might just say briefly that I had a group of graduate students who spent a semester with me thinking about how to reimagine the way we teach undergraduate theory. And in the process, we found that people have done theory a lot of different ways, that are really compelling ways. Some people really, pair the classical with the contemporary work. Some people have, I love the way people have scholars reading against each other at the same time, and that. But I think ultimately you just have to make a choice, because if it's 12 weeks, and so what we actually did was we decided to be very explicit about our theory. And we went from sort of the late 1800s, when sociology was being founded, into about the time that Parsons was developing the canon. And so we just decided that that's what we can do in our 12 weeks. But I think there's a lot of ways to approach it.
I'll add something. I mean, I also think it depends a lot, and what's sort of lurking underneath this discussion, I think it depends a lot on the purpose of the course. I think, as I was saying, when I'm teaching, what I'm really after is an intuition, and that intuition can come in the classical theorist, but it can also come in work that is, produced later and earlier. So I'm not tied to that being the purpose of my course. It I think makes me less tied to period, even independent of the structure I inherited at Michigan. I think what Jocelyn was describing is a course with a really different purpose, which is a deep interrogation of the historical foundations of our discipline. And that's a very valuable exercise. It's a different exercise than I'm engaged in my course. And I think that's one of the things that's really generative about this discussion, is there are so many things that instructors are doing in theory courses, depending on what the objective of that course is. So I don't think there's one answer to the period question. I think it depends a lot on what the purpose of a given theory course is and how that fits into a broader curriculum.
Okay, we have a number of questions about kind of around the sort of what's in and also what's out. So one person posted the question of like, as you try kind of something I think Greta, you alluded to in your discussion, you have this sort of fixed, whatever it is, 12 or 16 weeks, and you have a fixed volume of graduate attention. How do you grapple with what's in and out? So I know Greta, you talked a little explicitly about this, but I don't know if some of the other authors want to speak to the idea of like, how do you decide what to remove from, you know, the space that Marx, Weber, and Durkheim would would have taken up historically in some of these classes in the past? How do you choose which things you take out and which you put in? And then someone else asking another question that where they'd be interesting to hear what sort of writing people are incorporating into their theory courses from authors outside of Europe and North America. So what are the voices that you think, if you can recommend to the rest of us, point us in a path, we should be incorporating into these conversations in a really fruitful way?
Well, I can say what was lost from my syllabus when I revamped it was Arendt, Polanyi, and Habermas, and I can live without Habermas, but I was pained by Arendt and Polanyi, and I'm still thinking about that. And I do think that's the rub with all of this is, you know, for a variety of idiosyncratic reasons, we become very attached to particular thinkers and particular texts, and, you know, to sort of let them go and realize, okay, well, I can teach that in a different context, maybe, you know. But I think that's the painful part of this, is realizing there is a zero-sum aspect. There is only so much attention. As far as what non-European theorists have been added, I mean, no one has mentioned Fanon, and I think that's an addition I made, but I think it's a real, really valuable addition to a kind of a, again, if you're not fixating too much on period, that's a little late for a conventional classical syllabus, but works just fine for the course I teach.
Zine or Jose, do you want to weigh in at all on kind of how you think about what to call out or who perhaps to call out?
I mean, I teach Marx, Weber, Durkheim because, yeah, those are the, I mean, I agree they were not the founders, but they are the ones that were canonized. And you mentioned at the beginning when you presented our book that we want to canonize the boys, and that's not the idea. It is, I mean, we started with that idea, but realized no, that the whole thing is to bring a whole different perspective. So I would say, you know, with Du Bois, with Fanon, you can bring C.L.R. James, you know, Sylvia Wynter, you know, Walter Rodney, a number of thinkers. I mean, they may not be classical, but if we are going to undo the barriers, I mean, there is a whole, you know, what Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition, that there is room to bring them. I teach also, you know, Mead and Schutz, because, you know, I have an affection for the micro-interactional tradition. But again, when I teach them in contrast with Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper, and see how their, you know, their blindness to questions of race and gender affects their theorizing. And again, it's not about teaching people from non-European and North American backgrounds, because, you know, I know of enough theorists, you know, from Latin America that adopt the kind of modernizing view that was at the root of the discipline. So it's not a question of geography; it's a question of perspectives. Therefore, you know, Du Bois, is Du Bois an American thinker? Yes, definitely, he's an American thinker, but he's also a global thinker. I mean, and again, Anna Julia Cooper talks, as Zine pointed out in her dissertation, she makes a marvelous analysis of the French Revolution as a global revolution, bringing Haiti to the center of debate. So, I mean, so again, it's not a question of geography, of bringing voices from outside North America and Europe for the sake of doing that. It's a question of bringing perspectives from wherever they are that are different from those colonial and racist perspectives that Jocelyn talked about, that are at the foundation of the discipline. And I would be provocative here. I would say they are not just in the past, they are in the present. And if we are not careful and if we don't deconstruct our thing, we keep repeating them.
Zine, I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear her?
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. So I would say I actually kept it to Marx, Weber, and Durkheim partially because the course rotates between 3 people. And so it seemed unfair to students that like you just got such an uneven thing, like why did we ever read the Protestant ethic, right? So for me, what I do is I still orient it around those same texts, but I actually decolonize them. So it's fantastic to read the Protestant ethic alongside Julian Go's article about the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and you know, a meeting of all the colonial thinkers, right? And like with Du Bois being there, right? So I anchor it all around all the same stuff. And I'm like, actually, even at the time, it was recognized that all of this global stuff was going on. And so that way I haven't, and again, you know, people just have enough time to read a certain number of things. And I mean, no offense, but people didn't read half the stuff anyway. So I was able to take them through the things that everyone's expected to have them read. You should have read Capital. You should have read Protestant Ethic. I think it's just like only fair that they're spit out into the system with the same stuff as the other people that don't get the you know, the new hyped up version, but also a decolonized reading of those texts that people have kind of deemed to be central.
The first time we tried to bring in the Global South, we mostly focused on people who were writing about colonialization. So we had Fanon, we had Césaire, we had CLR James. The students really responded powerfully to CLR James. But some of the students wrote back and said, yeah, you're trying to bring in the, you know, non sort of Western perspectives, Jocelyn, but you're bringing them in a way that's still writing back against the West, right? And so are there other things that you could do to bring in non-Western perspectives talking about something that's not necessarily in response to the West? So I was looking for the source. I'm not finding it, and my books are of course all at the office, but Andy Abbott, writing at the University of Chicago, of course, did this whole sort of series in AJS that talked about some scholars from around the world, and they've recently pulled these little sort of interesting bibliographies together in a book that you can get on Amazon. I'll try and find the site and send it to you all soon. But I found that that was useful to just kind of see what other kinds of ideas were explored out there. And then we even did just kind of some crazy things for 1 week this semester where we decided, okay, what if we just took one theme and looked at how people were looking at this elsewhere? And so we thought, okay, we talk a lot about religion with some of these other scholars. So what if we just went and looked in sociology of religion in China and sociology of religion in India and sociology of religion in other places? And we found some pretty provocative different resources out there that we put on the syllabus, but then the pandemic hit. And so I can't really respond as to how we ended up cutting a lot of them at the end, and so I'm not sure how it would have unfolded.
Yeah, so that responds partially to some of the questions that were raised about people being curious about how students respond to this, or perhaps respond to this style of presentation in a way that might be different from the way the kind of stale, older way of presenting the classics is done. I mean, it's kind of interesting. And the point you just raises the need in sociology for something like the Bechdel test that they have in movies. Like, is it just women talking about men? Like the sense of presenting scholars not because they're speaking to white Eurocentric scholarship, but speaking from their own positionality for the sake of it as a kind of goal to strive towards understanding as well, because it enriches our knowledge of the human experience and the sort of central sociological pursuits.
I could follow up with one more point and then I'll be quiet. I think that it's really different to talk about teaching this to undergraduates, right? Because I don't need my undergraduate sociologists to go out and be experts in sociology. And so if we limit it to Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and then we bring in all these different ways of thinking about the social construction of knowledge, I feel like that's a really powerful gift to give to undergraduates. But I'm also very aware of the fact that when we train graduate students in theory, we're actually training them to be part of this community and be part of this discipline. And I think that raises a lot of different questions. And so it's a little easier, I think, on the undergraduate side.
All right, do any of our panelists want to have a last word before we sign off and release everyone back into, you know, your vibrant social life in which you go everywhere and see all the people all the time. All right, well, if no one wants to step up, I'll just say thank you to everyone. I feel so grateful. It was so lovely for me to have this on my Thursday afternoon. I'm heading straight from this into finalizing my syllabus construction. I have benefited so enormously from the resources that the panelists and others have shared. I am so, so grateful to you all. If there are other people who feel like there are conversations we need to push further down the road, if there are people who want to be part of the sort of working group thinking through how to do this, please reach out to me and let me know what you think we could talk more about and what more needs to be done. I mean, obviously we have a lot of work that needs to be done, but thank you guys for leading us, pointing us in some really fruitful direction to start that process. You're seeing a lot of love pop up for you in the chat, so I hope that you see all of that. I will save and share the recording. I will save the chat. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. So an applause to all of you for coming out for this. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Erin.